Hi, welcome back. We are going to cover First and Second Samuel today, which is basically after the conquest, Joshua's conquest of Canaan, establishing the tribal confederacy, which was the loose confederation of the 12 tribes. And then after the book of Judges, which was a series of stories of various judges of each of the tribes and their skirmishes or encounters with their neighboring Canaanite enemies. Okay. At the end of the last video, I had mentioned that at the end of the book of Judges, um, during the story actually of Samson and Delilah, uh, um, one of the peoples that they were fighting with, the judges were fighting with, were the Philistines. Now, this is from the chapter 5 PowerPoint from chapter 5 of Hauer. And essentially, you know, Hauer is talking about how in the book of Judges, there's some judges that are mentioned, and I suggested that you read several of the stories. And at the end of the book of Judges, the equilibrium between Israel and Canaan were upset by the appearance of the Philistines, meaning around 1050, the 11th century BCE, the Philistines were a group of what are called sea peoples, or they came from the Mediterranean, not like mermaids, but people who were very, very powerful and very influential and kind of circumambulated the Mediterranean world and frequently would like land and then had so much superior technology that they would easily threaten, various coastal places, especially a place like Israel where, or, the tribal confederacy where it's kind of loosely affiliated. So it's not like they're one big country. They're just like 12 separate areas with a judge. So when the Philistines, landed on the shores of the tribal confederacy, they had superior weapons because they had iron technology versus bronze. They began to occupy, like take over the coastal areas of Israel, which then controlled the economy because it was access to the water or Mediterranean trade. They they brought in watertight plaster, which was something that hadn't been in Canaan before this point, which accounted for a larger water supply. And they also actually brought in camels, which was not in the Middle East at that point. They brought those in from North Africa as pack animals, and they don't drink as much water or poop as much as pack animals, so or donkeys and horses. So it ended up that the Philistines were a major threat. Superior technology on so many different levels and controlling the coast, which basically meant controlling the economy. So the Israelites had to really organize a resistance or just submit to these Philistines. So what happens is the 12 tribes decide they need to unify under one leader, and they come together under a monarchy. Now, the first intermediate king was a gentleman named Saul, which Hauer mentions. And after Saul kind of does most of the fighting against the Philistines, David takes over and essentially finishes the war with the Philistines and establishes the nation state of Israel. So why don't we take a look at just kind of the rise of that. In First Samuel, we are introduced to a character named Samuel, who is kind of like a judge and a prophet at the same time. He's more like a judge than a prophet, but certainly not a king yet. And he is kind of elected to be the final judge in face of the Philistine threat. He's special, so these first two chapters describe how he is kind of dedicated to God as a Nazarene. A Nazarene was someone that would, a special kind of Hebrew or a special kind of group that were dedicated to God by not living in houses of stone and not cutting their hair and not wearing clothing that was manufactured by industry like cotton. Essentially, like John the Baptist was a Nazarene, someone who embraced the wilderness style of life versus civilized city life. So Samuel was one of these Nazarenes, and he was dedicated to God as one of basically the final judge. So if you look at the first couple of chapters of First Samuel, that's the description of who this individual might be. When you go to 1 Samuel 7, this is a description of Samuel as the judge, kind of organize the people of the 12 tribal confederacy against the Philistines, and essentially, describing that encroaching Philistine threat. So that's Samuel kind of, trying to grab a hold of it. What happens in chapter 8 is instead of having some sort of figure like Samuel or Moses or Abraham where they're kind of directly in relationship or in contract with God, what Israel then demands is, that's not good enough. These Philistines are too much. Let's have a king. And they demand a king. And God and Samuel warned them, listen, if you have a king, you're going to, put all your honor and obeisance to the king and not to God. The person you really should be relying on is God. And if you start relying on things like the military or the king or things that other countries do, you're going to regret it. So Samuel said, they say, we want a king, give us a king to govern us. And the Lord said, okay, listen to the voice of the people. So he said, okay, I'm going to tell you, God will let you elect a king, which will be Saul, but these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He's going to take your sons and appoint them to his chariots to be his horsemen, to run before his chariots. He will, basically exploit and take everything, from the land and from the people. The equipment of his chariot, he'll take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll take the best of your fields and vineyards and give them to his courtiers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourself. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. But they are determined to have a king over us. They say, we want a king. We can't get rid of the Philistines unless you give us a king. So it's a warning, essentially, that by electing a king and by choosing to kind of go against God and not trust in God and the covenant, that this is going to be a sign that modern kingship, modern monarchy is the beginning of the end. Like when you start to rely on things other than God, God might not be so happy and things might not turn out so well, which ends up being true. So they demand the king, and in 1 Samuel 10, he then chooses Saul to be the intermediate king. And then the rest of 1 Samuel is a description of Saul's attempts to fight the Philistines and to kind of organize his army, and also to push back the threat of a young David rising through his ranks, being sort of a threat to Saul's kingship. So Saul isn't depicted so well in 1 Samuel and in the Bible. He's got a lot on his plate. He's trying to figure out the monarchy. He's fighting the Philistines. This young upstart David, who's just killed the mighty Philistine Goliath with a slingshot, is kind of encroaching and threatening his kingship. So at the end, Saul, who probably was a good king, ends up committing suicide in battle. Not a great reflection of his kingship, but he did a lot of work to protect the Confederacy and to transition it to a monarchy. So that's 1 Samuel. And then if we go to 2 Samuel, here we go. 2 Samuel, after the death of Saul, David takes over and essentially finishes off the Philistines. And part of the process of David's kingship is he's a great king. He consolidates the 12 tribes. He conquers the city of Jerusalem, excuse me. He conquers the city of Jerusalem, which had never been in the control of the tribal confederacy, and he makes that the capital of this new nation. He moves the Ark of the Covenant, that box, which contains the two tablets and represents God being among you. He moves that to Jerusalem as well, and essentially makes it the religious capital of this new country. So under David, he conquers the Philistines, takes over from Saul's kingship. He makes a capital city that's relatively neutral. He makes it the religious capital as well. He conquers a lot of land and essentially has a very healthy, balanced budget, burgeoning nation state that is, the envy of its neighbors. So under David, things are pretty good. Things are actually end up being quite good. So he takes over. He kind of organizes his kingdom in the beginning of Second Samuel. Let's look at 5. He's anointed king of all of Israel by chapter 5, and here he is. He makes Jerusalem the capital of this united kingdom, and so things are looking good for David. Okay, until he brings the ark to Jerusalem in chapter 6. Until we hit his kind of middle-aged time period, where after when David kind of functions at his best when he's fighting and organizing and consolidating and doing all these things and kind of keeping his senses alert. Starting in chapter 11, this is what Howard talks about in terms of the succession narrative, where all of a sudden we dip into the private life of the king, and all of a sudden we're privy to a lot of very private, personal information about the king. So that in terms of the intrigue of his court, all of a sudden we're stepping into his relationships with his children and adultery and affairs and things that maybe wasn't so prevalent in the earlier chapters of 1st and 2nd Samuel, where he's just doing a lot of fighting with the Philistines. Okay? So when we get to chapter 11, in the spring of the year, this is 2 Samuel chapter 11, when kings go out to battle, David sends Joab with his officers and all Israel. Joab is his kind of right-hand man, and all of Israel with him, but he remains at Jerusalem. So you already know if David is not fighting and keeping his wits sharp, he's going to get into trouble, because you need him fighting. You don't want him sitting around and dallying, with various things, which is basically what will happen. So I'm going to end it here, and we will go over chapters 11 to 13 and 15 and talk about Solomon and then the eventual breakup of the monarchy. It ends up that David, who establishes the nation state of Israel in the year 1000 BCE, it only lasts until 922 BCE, meaning about 80 years, 78 years. You have a unified Israel. And then in 922, it breaks into 2 states, and you never really have the nation state of Israel again until 1948. After the World War II, when Israel is given back to the Jews. Unfortunately, there's all these people there called Palestinians, Palestinian Arabs, Christians, and Jews, and we have that whole issue once again. So anyway, let's stop there, and I will go over 2 Samuel 11 through 13, which is kind of a personal account of his relationship with his children, and then also go over Solomon, who was his son, and then talk about the divided monarchy, which happens after Solomon. Okay?